Welcome to Mystic Bedtime Stories, where ancient mysteries whisper their secrets into the gentle darkness. I'm your guide tonight on a journey to one of history's greatest enigmas, perfect for your peaceful drift towards sleep. As you settle into comfort, letting the day's tensions dissolve like salt in warm water, close your eyes and listen to the sound of waves. Not just any waves, but the ancient Mediterranean as it was 3,000 years ago, when mighty empires lined its shores and great cities sparkled like jewels in the coastal twilight. Picture that forgotten world, Egypt at the height of its power, its pharaohs corresponding with Hittite kings as equals, the Mycenaean lords counting treasures in their fortress palaces, Canaanite ports bustling with merchants from Cyprus and Crete. This was the Bronze Age at its pinnacle, a sophisticated world of trade networks and diplomatic marriages of bronze, weapons and cuneiform tablets of civilizations that seemed destined to endure forever. But listen more carefully to those ancient waves. Do you hear it? Beneath their soothing rhythm lies another sound, the distant splash of oars cutting through dark water, sails straining against Mediterranean winds, ships bearing mysterious passengers whose very names would become synonymous with terror and transformation. The Sea Peoples, the Sheridan and Peliset, the Jeker and Danayan, names that whisper from the margins of history like half-remembered dreams. They emerged from unknown shores around 1200 BCE, and in the span of 50 years, they would bring down empires that had stood for centuries. The great Hittite kingdom would vanish so completely that its existence would be forgotten. Mycenaean palaces would burn, their archives becoming the final records of a dying world. Who were they? Refugees from climate disaster? Displaced warriors? Organized sea raiders? The mystery deepens with every archaeological discovery, every translated tablet, every burned city that tells its silent story of sudden change. Tonight, in the peaceful sanctuary of your rest, we sail with these enigmatic wanderers across the wine-dark waters of antiquity. We'll witness the end of the Bronze Age world and explore how anonymous peoples can reshape history more profoundly than any named king or queen. The Sea Peoples left no monuments, no literature, no great works of art. They come to us only through the terrified accounts of their enemies and the silent testimony of ruins. Yet perhaps in their very mystery lies their power to speak to us across 3 millennia, reminding us that change often arrives not as grand design, but as the accumulated force of countless individual journeys across uncertain waters. Feel yourself beginning to drift now as the familiar world fades into comfortable distance. The ancient Mediterranean stretches before us, dark and full of secrets. Somewhere in that shimmering expanse, the lights of doomed cities twinkle like stars about to be extinguished, and phantom ships carry passengers who will change the world, and then vanish back into legend. Welcome aboard this vessel of dreams and memory, where history and mystery intertwine in the gentle rhythm of waves. The greatest untold story of the ancient world begins now, in the twilight space between waking and sleeping, where the Sea Peoples still sail their endless voyage across waters that connect all times, all stories, all moments in the vast ocean of human experience. Drift with me now to a time when the Mediterranean was the center of a world unlike any that had existed before. Picture yourself floating high above this ancient sea, looking down through the crystalline waters of time at a civilization that stretched like a golden web across 3 continents. This was the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1200 BCE, and it was humanity's first truly international age. Below us, gleaming cities rise from fertile plains and commanding heights. Each one is a jewel in a crown that no single ruler wears. Yet all are connected by invisible threads of trade, diplomacy, and shared ambition. The Hittite Empire sprawls across Anatolia, its capital Hattusa carved into the living rock of the mountains. To the south, Egypt stretches along the life-giving Nile, its pharaohs corresponding with kings as far away as Babylon. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean palaces of Greece shimmer like mirages, their linear B tablets recording transactions that span the known world. Imagine yourself walking through the streets of Ugarit, that great cosmopolitan port on the Syrian coast. The morning air is thick with the scent of cedar and spices, the sound of a dozen languages mixing like currents in a busy harbor. Merchants from Cyprus display their copper ingots alongside Mycenaean pottery painted with octopi and dolphins. Egyptian gold changes hands for Hittite silver, while scribes scratch cuneiform and hieroglyphic records onto clay and papyrus. This is not the primitive world we sometimes imagine when we think of ancient times. These are sophisticated societies with complex bureaucracies, standing armies, and diplomatic corps that would seem familiar to any modern foreign ministry. Kings write to each other as brothers, addressing one another with the elaborate courtesy of equals. Ramses II of Egypt calls the Hittite king Hattusili III my brother, while gifts flow between royal courts like tributaries feeding a great river. The palace at Pylos, in what we now call Greece, contains storerooms filled with records written in Linear B, an early form of Greek that would not be deciphered until the 1950s. These tablets speak of a world where wool from sheep grazing on Peloponnesian hills is woven into cloth for export to Egypt, where bronze weapons are cataloged with the precision of a modern inventory system, where religious festivals are planned with the attention to detail of a diplomatic summit in the great trading center of Kanish. In the heart of Anatolia, Assyrian, merchants maintain elaborate archives documenting business relationships that span generations. They write letters home describing profits and losses, family news and political developments, creating an intimate portrait of how ordinary people lived within this grand international system. Their clay tablets reveal a world where a merchant's son might travel from Mesopotamia to Egypt, conducting business in half a dozen languages, as comfortable in a Hittite court as in his father's counting house. But perhaps nowhere was this interconnected world more evident than in the island kingdom of Alassia, which we now know as Cyprus. Rich in copper, Cyprus was the Silicon Valley of the Bronze Age, its mines providing the essential ingredient for the bronze tools and weapons that gave this era its name. Ships from every corner of the Mediterranean called at Cypriot ports, creating a cultural melting pot where Egyptian scarabs might be found alongside Mycenaean, stirrup jars, and Canaanite pottery. The technology of this age was sophisticated in ways that might surprise us. Bronze smiths had perfected techniques for creating alloys of copper and tin that produced metal superior to either component alone. Shipbuilders constructed vessels capable of carrying tons of cargo across open seas, guided by knowledge of winds and currents passed down through generations of seafarers. Architects raised massive structures that still inspire awe today, from the Lion Gate at Mycenae to the great temples of Karnak. Yet for all its sophistication, this Bronze Age world system was built on foundations more fragile than its builders. New. The great powers maintained their positions through delicate balances of military strength, economic cooperation, and diplomatic protocol. Trade routes that took generations to establish could be disrupted by a single war. Alliances carefully crafted through royal marriages could dissolve with the death of a key ruler. The climate itself was a partner in this grand enterprise, providing the stable weather patterns that allowed agriculture to flourish and trade to flow predictably across vast distances. The regular flooding of the Nile, the reliable winds that carried ships across the Mediterranean, the seasonal rains that watered the wheat fields of Anatolia, all were taken as permanent features of a world that seemed as enduring as the stars themselves. In the great library at Hattusa, scribes copied treaties onto bronze tablets, believing they were recording agreements that would last for all time. In the palace workshops of Knossos, Artists painted frescoes showing dolphins leaping through azure seas, capturing a moment of beauty that seemed as eternal as the Mediterranean itself. In the temples of Memphis, priests performed rituals that had been unchanged for 1,000 years, confident that they would continue unchanged for 1,000 more. But even in this golden age, there were whispers of trouble on the horizon. Hittite archives speak of raiders from the sea troubling the coasts of Anatolia. Egyptian records mention mysterious peoples appearing at the edges of their influence. Mycenaean palaces begin to fortify their walls and stockpile weapons. The great system that had brought unprecedented prosperity to the Mediterranean world was showing signs of strain. Some modern scholars believe that climate change was already beginning to affect this Bronze Age paradise. Tree ring data suggests that droughts were becoming more frequent and severe. Archaeological evidence points to crop failures and population movements in regions that had been stable for centuries. Perhaps the Golden Age was already tarnishing, its foundations quietly eroding like cliffs worn away by centuries of waves. Yet to those who lived in the last bright summers of the Bronze Age, such concerns must have seemed distant and manageable. They had weathered crises before. Their institutions had proven their resilience through centuries of testing. Their gods were strong, their kings were wise, their traders were prosperous. The great wheel of civilization turned as it always had, carrying them forward into what they assumed would be an even brighter future. How could they have known that even then, somewhere beyond the familiar horizons of their world, forces were gathering that would sweep away everything they had built? How could they have imagined that their letters between kings would become museum curiosities? Their mighty palaces would become archaeological sites. Their thriving cities would become tells covered in grass and wildflowers? Rest easy now in this moment of ancient tranquility before the storm clouds gather on the horizon. Feel the warm Mediterranean sun on your face. Hear the gentle splash of merchant ships entering busy harbors. Smell the cedar and frankincense, carried on trade winds that have blown since time immemorial. This is the world as it was, perfect and eternal, in the last peaceful evening before everything changed forever. But now, as you drift deeper into the realm of dreams and memory, the peaceful scene begins to shift. The horizon darkens, not with the gentle approach of night, but with something else entirely. Ships appear on the distant waters, but these are not the familiar merchant vessels of the Bronze Age trade network. These ships move differently, with purpose that speaks not of commerce, but of something far more urgent, far more desperate. Let yourself float closer to these mysterious vessels, close enough to see their occupants, but not so close as to disturb. The dream. What you witness here are the sea peoples, though they would never have called themselves by that name. That title was bestowed upon them by their Egyptian enemies, who knew them only as the terror that came from the waters. The chaos that sailed out of the unknown reaches of the Mediterranean, not the Egyptians, those meticulous record-keepers of the ancient world, left us lists of names that sound like whispers from a half-remembered nightmare. Shurden, they wrote in their hieroglyphs, carving the name deep into temple walls. Shekelesh, Lukka, Peliset, Cheker, Dinayan, Weshesh. Each name represents not just a tribe or a people, but an entire world in motion. Entire civilizations torn loose from their moorings and cast adrift upon the wine-dark sea. Imagine yourself standing in the great temple complex at Medinet Habu, where Ramses III commanded his scribes to record these foreign names for all eternity. Feel the cool stone beneath your feet, worn smooth by 30 centuries of pilgrims and scholars. The hieroglyphs seem to shimmer in the torchlight, and if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the ancient voices whispering the syllables of peoples whose own languages have been lost to time. But who were they really? These phantom raiders who emerged from the mists of prehistory to reshape the ancient world? The truth is that we are still searching for them. still piecing together fragments of their story from the scattered remains they left behind. They were like a storm that passes in the night, leaving only wreckage and wandering in its wake. Some scholars believe they came from the Aegean world, refugees from the very Mycenaean palaces we visited in our previous chapter. Perhaps they were the survivors of internal conflicts, civil wars that tore apart the sophisticated Bronze Age kingdoms of Greece. Picture them loading their families onto ships as their cities burned behind them, carrying nothing but weapons, hope, and the desperate courage of people who have nothing left to lose. Others suggest they originated in Anatolia, possibly displaced by the collapse of the Hittite Empire itself. In this version of the story, they were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, but its first victims, pushed westward and southward by pressures we can barely imagine. Perhaps they were the seafaring peoples of the Anatolian coast, fishermen and traders who knew every inlet and harbor of the eastern Mediterranean, suddenly transformed into pirates by necessity rather than choice. There is evidence that some groups came from even farther west, from Sicily and Sardinia, from the mysterious reaches of the western Mediterranean that the Bronze Age powers barely knew existed. Archaeological finds on these islands show sudden changes in material culture around 1200 BCE, suggesting that populations were on the move throughout the Mediterranean world. These Western peoples might have been drawn eastward by tales of the rich cities and fertile lands of the Levant in Egypt, like iron filings drawn to a magnet. But perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that the sea peoples were not a single confederation at all, but rather a phenomenon, a pattern of migration and warfare that emerged simultaneously across the Mediterranean as the old world order began to break down. Climate change may have played a role, with prolonged droughts forcing agricultural peoples to abandon their traditional lands and take to the sea in search of new homes. Imagine the desperation that would drive a farmer to become a seafarer, to load his family and possessions onto boats and sail toward an uncertain horizon. Picture the courage required to leave behind ancestral lands, sacred places, the graves of the fathers, and venture into the unknown vastness of the Mediterranean. These were not casual raiders, but desperate migrants, peoples caught between a dying past and an uncertain future. The sea peoples fought with weapons that tell their own story of a world in transition. Bronze swords gave way to iron blades, representing not just a change in technology, but a shift in the very foundations of civilization. Iron ore was more widely available than the tin required for bronze, making it possible for displaced peoples to arm themselves without access to the complex trade networks that had sustained the Bronze Age powers. Their ships, too, were different from the merchant vessels of the established powers. Where Bronze Age traders built wide, stable ships designed to carry maximum cargo, the sea peoples sailed in vessels built for speed and maneuverability. These were the ships of people always ready to fight or flee, to strike quickly and disappear before their enemies could respond. Some of these mysterious peoples seem to have been professionals of warfare, mercenaries who had served in the armies of the great powers and learned their weaknesses from within. The Shurden, for instance, are mentioned in Egyptian records as both enemies and allies, raiders who attacked Egypt's coasts and elite troops who served in Pharaoh's personal guard. This suggests a complex relationship between the sea peoples and the civilizations they encountered, one that went beyond simple conquest to include negotiation, alliance, and integration. The Peleset, who would later settle in Canaan and become known to history as the Philistines, brought with them distinctive pottery styles and architectural techniques that show clear connections to the Aegean world. Yet they also adapted quickly to their new homes, adopting local customs and eventually becoming so thoroughly integrated into the Levantine cultural landscape that their origins were forgotten until modern archaeology rediscovered them. As you drift through this dreamscape of ancient migrations, you might catch glimpses of families huddled on wooden decks, children who had never known any home but the rocking of a ship, warriors sharpening iron blades by the light of stars they had, followed across half the Mediterranean. These were not the barbarian hordes of popular imagination, but complex peoples caught in the currents of historical change, driven by forces beyond their control toward destinations they could not foresee. The mystery deepens when we consider that these peoples left almost no written records of their own. We see them only through the eyes of their enemies and victims, in Egyptian temple inscriptions that celebrate their defeat, in Assyrian annals that record their movements in the eye, archaeological layers of destroyed cities where their passing is marked by ash and abandonment. Were they destroyers or merely survivors? Were they the cause of the Bronze Age collapse or its consequence? These questions hover around the sea peoples like morning mist around ancient harbors, obscuring as much as they reveal. What we know for certain is that they were there, at the pivot point of history, when one age ended and another began. Feel yourself drifting now among their ghost ships, listening to the creak of rope and timber, the splash of oars cutting through dark water. Somewhere in the distance, the lights of the old world still burn, but they are growing dimmer, and the darkness between them is spreading like spilled ink across the map of the known world. The sea peoples sail on, carrying their secrets with them into the pages of history, where they will forever remain both central to the story and fundamentally unknowable, like figures glimpsed in the periphery of vision, always just beyond the reach of perfect understanding. Now, as you float deeper into this ancient dreamscape, the peaceful Mediterranean world we first encountered begins to transform before your eyes. Time moves differently here, in this space between sleeping and waking, and you find yourself witnessing not days or months, but entire decades compressed into moments of terrible clarity. The lights of the great Bronze Age cities, which seem so permanent and eternal, begin to flicker and fade one by one, like stars going out at the end of the world. Let yourself drift first to the coast of Syria, to the great trading city of Ugarit. Just yesterday, in the compressed time of dreams, this was a bustling cosmopolitan center where merchants from a dozen nations gathered to exchange goods and gossip. The royal palace rose in terraces from the harbor, its walls decorated with ivory inlays and precious metals. Scribes worked in multiple languages, recording transactions in cuneiform, hieroglyphic, and the revolutionary alphabetic script that Ugarit had helped to develop. But now, as you hover above the city like a spirit carried on the night wind, you can see smoke beginning to rise from its streets. The harbor, once filled with merchant vessels from across the Mediterranean, now hosts ships of a different kind. These are the vessels of the sea peoples, their bronze-reinforced prows cutting through the water like the beaks of hungry seabirds. When it comes, is swift and overwhelming. There is no grand siege, no lengthy negotiation, no diplomatic solution. The sea peoples strike like a summer storm, sudden and devastating. Palace walls that have stood for centuries crumble under the assault of iron weapons wielded by desperate hands. The great library, with its thousands of cuneiform tablets recording the wisdom and commerce of ages, disappears beneath flames that will burn for days. Watch now as the scene shifts, time flowing like water around your dreaming consciousness. You find yourself above another great city, Hattusa, the mountain capital of the Hittite Empire. Built on a high plateau in the heart of Anatolia, this was perhaps the most impressive city of its age, its massive stone walls seeming to grow out of the living rock itself. The great temples within housed 1,000 gods of the Hittan pantheon, while the royal archives contained treaties with every major power of the known world. But even these mighty walls cannot hold back the tide of change that sweeps across the ancient world. Perhaps the sea peoples never reached this mountain stronghold directly, but their influence spreads like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Trade routes that sustained the Hittite economy are severed. Tributary states rebel, or simply vanish. The complex network of alliances that maintained Hittite power unravels like a tapestry pulled apart thread by thread. The end, when it comes, is almost anticlimactic. There is no single moment of destruction, no dramatic siege or battle. Instead, the great city simply empties, its inhabitants melting away like snow in spring. The royal archives are carefully buried by the last loyal scribes, who perhaps hoped that someday someone would return to reclaim them. But that day never comes. Hattusa becomes a ghost city, its empty streets walked only by wind and wild animals. Now you drift westward, carried by currents of time and imagination toward the Aegean Sea. Below you, the landscape is dotted with the great palaces of Mycenaean Greece, each one a center of Bronze Age civilization. Pylos, with its archives of linear B tablets. Tiryns, with its cyclopean walls built of stones so massive that later Greeks believed only giants could have moved them. And greatest of all, Mycenae itself, the golden city of Agamemnon, looking out over the plain of Argos from its commanding hilltop. These citadels had seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves, their rulers claiming descent from the gods, their warriors celebrated in songs that would echo through the centuries. But now you watch as one by one, they too succumb to the great catastrophe that is reshaping the Mediterranean world. Some show signs of sudden violence, walls breached, by attackers who knew the weaknesses of Bronze Age fortifications. Others seem to have been abandoned more gradually, their populations drifting away as the economic and political systems that sustained them collapsed. At Pylos, the palace burned so completely that the clay tablets in its archives are baked hard by the heat, inadvertently preserving them for modern archaeologists to discover. But in their own time, this preservation was meaningless. The scribes who could read linear B were gone. The administrative systems they recorded were destroyed. The very language they wrote gradually forgot how to write itself. Turn your dreaming gaze now toward the island of Cyprus, that copper-rich kingdom known to the ancients as Alasia. This island had been neutral ground in the Bronze Age world, its mines too valuable for any single power to monopolize, its location too strategic for any alliance to ignore. But neutrality offers no protection when the entire system of international relations collapses. The great copper-working cities of Cyprus burn as fiercely as any on the mainland. Enkomi, with its sophisticated workshops and cosmopolitan population, is reduced to ash and broken pottery. The island's carefully maintained diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and Mesopotamia comes to an abrupt end. The last king of Alasia sends a desperate letter to his counterpart in Ugarit, reporting that his cities are under attack by people who come from the sea. It is one of the last communications in a diplomatic network that had functioned for centuries. But perhaps nowhere is the scope of this catastrophe more evident than in the Levant, that crossroads of the ancient world where Africa, Asia, and Europe meet. Here, cities that had stood for millennia vanish almost overnight. Hazor, one of the largest cities in the ancient Near East, is burned so thoroughly that its destruction layer can still be clearly seen by archaeologists today. Lachish, Megiddo, Ashdod, one after another, they fall to forces that seem to strike everywhere at once. The attackers are not always the sea peoples themselves. Sometimes they are local populations taking advantage of the chaos, old grievances finally finding their moment for revenge. Sometimes they are other migrating groups, displaced by the same forces that created the sea peoples, competing for the same scarce resources and safe harbors. The destruction spreads like wildfire, each burning city creating new refugees who must seek shelter elsewhere, adding to the pressure on communities that are already struggling to survive. In your dream vision, you can see the human cost of this collapse more clearly than any archaeological report could convey. Families loading their possessions onto carts, not knowing where they will find safety. Children who will grow up knowing only the road, the temporary camp, the constant uncertainty of displacement. Skilled craftsmen whose trades become meaningless when the workshops that employed them are nothing but rubble, and the trade networks that sustained them are severed. Yet even in this devastation, there are moments of unexpected beauty, scenes that will haunt your dreams with their poignant mixture of loss and hope. A scribe in a burning palace, carefully sealing important documents in clay jars before the flames reach his chamber. A mother singing a lullaby to her child as their ship carries them toward an unknown shore. Warriors from different tribes sharing water at a well, their weapons set aside in recognition of their common humanity. The archaeological record speaks in its own silent language of these traumatic times. Destruction layers thick with ash and debris mark the end of one world and the beginning of another. Hordes of bronze and precious objects, buried hastily by their owners who never returned to claim them, wait in the earth like time capsules from a vanished age. New pottery styles appear suddenly in the archaeological record, evidence of population movements on a scale not seen before or since. Some cities attempted to rebuild, their survivors clinging to familiar places despite the devastation around them. But these efforts were often short-lived. The economic and political networks that had sustained Bronze Age civilization were too thoroughly shattered to be easily repaired. Trade routes that had operated for centuries were abandoned. Technologies that had taken generations to develop were lost. Even languages disappeared, taking with them entire ways of understanding and organizing the world. The scale of this destruction is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective. Imagine if every major city in North America and Europe were simultaneously abandoned or destroyed, if all international trade ceased overnight, if the internet and telephone systems simply stopped working and no one remembered how to repair them. This approximates what happened to the Mediterranean world around 1200 BCE, a collapse so complete that it would take centuries for civilization to recover. Yet as you drift through this dreamscape of destruction, you begin to sense that this is not simply an ending, but also a transformation. The old world is dying, yes, but something new is being born from its ashes. The sea peoples themselves, those mysterious agents of change, are not merely destroyers, but also carriers of seeds, spreaders of new ideas and technologies that will eventually flower in unexpected places. Now your dreaming consciousness drifts southward, carried by the eternal winds that blow across the Mediterranean toward the land of the pharaohs. Here, where the Nile creates a ribbon of green life through endless desert, one great power still stands against the tide of chaos that has swept away so much of the ancient world. Egypt, the gift of the Nile, the kingdom that has endured for 3 millennia, faces its greatest test. Let yourself float gently down the great river, past temples whose stones have been shaped by centuries of craftsmen, past fields where farmers tend crops using methods unchanged since the time of the pyramids. The rhythm of life along the Nile seems as eternal as the river itself. But even here, in this most stable of ancient lands, the approaching storm can be felt in the quickening of preparations, the heightened vigilance of border guards, the worried conferences of priests and administrators. You find yourself now in the great temple complex at Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile, opposite the ancient city of Thebes. This is the mortuary temple of Ramses III, built to celebrate his victories and ensure his eternal glory. But these are not yet the carved stones of history you are witnessing. In your dream vision, you see the temple as it was in the moment of crisis, when the inscriptions were being planned and the battles they would commemorate were still being fought. Ramses III stands in his audience chamber, a man bearing the weight of 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition on his shoulders. He is the last of the great pharaohs, though he does not yet know it, a final ruler to successfully defend Egypt against foreign invasion. Around him, his advisors speak in urgent whispers, their words carrying news that would have seemed impossible just a generation before. The great powers of the north have fallen. Cities that sent tribute to Egypt for centuries have gone silent. And now, something new and terrible approaches from the sea. The reports reaching the pharaoh's court paint a picture of unprecedented chaos. Refugees stream into Egypt's northern territories, bringing tales of cities burned and populations scattered. Among them are survivors who speak of ships appearing on the horizon like storm clouds, vessels filled with warriors unlike any seen before. These are not the disciplined armies of established kingdoms, bound by the protocols of Bronze Age warfare. These are peoples fighting for their very survival, with the desperate ferocity of those who have nothing left to lose. In your dream, you can see the pharaoh's scribes at work, their reed pens scratching across papyrus as they record the names of the enemy peoples. Peliset, they write, the people who will later settle in Canaan and become known as Philistines. Checker, Shekelesh, Enian, each name representing not just a tribe, but an entire world in motion. The scribes struggle with unfamiliar sounds, trying to capture in hieroglyphs the names of peoples who have no writing system of their own. But Ramses III is not merely a recorder of events. He is a pharaoh in the ancient tradition, a god king, whose divine mandate requires him to defend the sacred land of Egypt against all threats. As reports reach him of the enemy's approach, he sets in motion the vast machinery of Egyptian military preparation. Messengers ride south along the Nile, carrying orders to garrison commanders throughout the kingdom. Granaries are secured, weapons are distributed, and the great war barges of the Egyptian navy are prepared for battle. The enemy, when they finally appear, exceed even the most alarming reports. Your dreaming vision carries you to the mouth of the Nile, where the delta spreads, like fingers into the Mediterranean. Here, where the sacred river meets the sea, you witness one of the most crucial battles in ancient history. The sea peoples have not come as raiders seeking quick plunder. They have come as an entire migration, their ships filled not just with warriors, but with families, possessions, livestock. This is not conquest, but desperate colonization, the movement of entire peoples seeking new homes. Their fleet stretches across the horizon, ships of every description pressed into service for this great migration. War vessels with bronze reinforced. Prows sail alongside fishing boats, loaded with household goods. Women and children huddle on deck beside warriors sharpening their weapons. Cattle low in makeshift pens constructed on ships' decks. This is not an army, but a civilization on the move, carrying everything it owns in a flotilla that represents both hope and desperation. The battle, when it comes, is fought both on water and on land. Egyptian war barges, their hulls painted, with protective symbols and their crews trained in the disciplined tactics of pharaonic warfare, engage the sea people's fleet in the shallow waters of the delta. Arrows fly like clouds of locusts, their bronze points glinting in the Mediterranean sun. Ships ram each other with the grinding crash of splintering wood and tearing bronze. Warriors leap from vessel to vessel, fighting hand to hand on decks, slippery with spray and blood. But it is on land that the decisive action takes place. Some of the sea peoples have managed to establish a foothold on Egyptian soil, setting up a fortified camp where their families wait while their warriors probe. Deeper into the delta, Ramses III himself leads the Egyptian counterattack, his golden chariot gleaming as he charges into battle surrounded by his elite guard. The clash of bronze on iron rings across the battlefield as two different ages of warfare meet in deadly embrace. Watch now as your dream vision focuses on the pharaoh himself, magnificent in his ceremonial armor, his bow sending arrow after arrow into the ranks of the enemy. This is the image that will be carved into temple walls, the moment that Egyptian artists will capture for eternity. But in your dream, you can see beyond the propaganda to the reality of a desperate struggle between a dying world and one struggling. To be born, the battle turns, as battles sometimes do, on a single moment of decision. Perhaps it is the sight of their king fighting in the front ranks that inspires the Egyptian soldiers to one final effort. Perhaps it is the realization that their families and everything they have, known for generations, depends on this day's outcome. The sea peoples, fighting far from any safe harbor, begin to give ground. The retreat becomes a rout, though even. In defeat, the sea peoples show the discipline that has carried them across half the Mediterranean. Their warriors fight rear-guard actions, while their families load onto ships, abandoning camps that represent months of careful preparation. Some vessels are captured, their crews taken prisoner to be interrogated by Egyptian scribes, eager to understand these mysterious enemies. But most escape, disappearing into the vastness of the Mediterranean to seek other shores, other opportunities. In the aftermath of victory, Ramses III orders the great commemoration that will preserve this moment for history. Temple walls will be carved with scenes of the battle, showing Egyptian forces triumphant over enemies, depicted with careful attention to their foreign dress and weapons. Hieroglyphic texts will proclaim the pharaoh's victory in terms that echo the greatest military achievements of Egypt's past. But you, floating in the timeless space of dreams, can see what the official inscriptions cannot admit. This victory, complete as it appears, has cost Egypt dearly. The kingdom's northern territories have been devastated by the fighting. The complex trade networks that once brought wealth from across the Mediterranean have been severed. Even in victory, Egypt finds itself isolated, the last survivor of a world that no longer exists. The prisoners taken in the battle provide Egyptian scribes with invaluable intelligence about the sea peoples, information that will be recorded in archives and inscribed on temple walls. Through their testimony, we learn something of the great migrations, the cities that fell, the routes the sea peoples followed in their desperate search for new homes. But even these captive voices speak only fragments of the larger story, pieces of a puzzle that will never be completely assembled. Some of the defeated sea peoples are allowed to settle in Egyptian territory, becoming garrison troops in frontier regions where their fighting skills can serve the pharaoh's interests. Others are integrated into Egyptian society, their children, growing up as Egyptians while carrying in their blood the memory of peoples whose names will be forgotten. A few are sent as gifts to allied kingdoms, though there are fewer of those than there once were. As your dream vision of this great battle fades, you find yourself back in the temple at Medinet Habu. But now the walls are covered with the inscriptions that celebrate Ramses III's victory. The hieroglyphs seem to glow with an inner light, preserving forever the moment when Egypt stood alone against the chaos that had consumed the rest of the Bronze Age world. But even in this moment of triumph, there is a sadness, a sense of endings rather than beginnings. For this will be Egypt's last great victory over foreign invasion for many centuries. The kingdom that has endured since the dawn of recorded history will continue, but never again will it command the respect and fear it once inspired. The world that made Egypt great, the world of international diplomacy and Mediterranean-wide trade networks, has died in the fires lit by the sea peoples and others like them. As your dreaming consciousness drifts away from the battlefields of Egypt, you find yourself drawn into a deeper mystery, one that whispers through the archaeological record like wind through ancient ruins. How did these sea peoples, these scattered groups without the resources of great kingdoms, manage to topple civilizations that had stood for centuries? What weapons did they carry? What knowledge did they possess that made them so devastatingly effective against the mightiest powers of their age? Let yourself float now through time and space to a blacksmith's forge somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, perhaps on the coast of Anatolia or among the islands of the Aegean. The forge glows like a fallen star in the darkness, and around it figures move with the purposeful grace of those who know their craft intimately. But something is different here, something that speaks of change as fundamental as the shift from stone to bronze that marked an earlier revolution in human capability. Watch as the smith pulls a blade from the fire, but this is not the familiar bronze of the old world. This metal glows with a different light, darker and somehow more ominous. This is iron, and in the hands of the sea peoples, it becomes more than just a new material. It becomes a key that unlocks the gates of a changing world. The transition from bronze to iron was not merely a technological shift, but a democratization of warfare itself. Bronze required tin, a relatively rare metal that had to be transported across vast distances through trade networks controlled by the great powers. The collapse of these networks made bronze scarce and expensive, available only to established kingdoms with access to stockpiled resources. But iron ore was everywhere, lying in the hills and valleys of the Mediterranean world, waiting for those who knew how to unlock its secrets. In your dream vision, you can see groups of sea peoples gathered around similar forges throughout there. Scattered communities. Some are refugees from the fallen palaces of Mycenae, craftsmen who once served kings, but now forge weapons for their own survival. Others are tribal smiths from the edges of the civilized world, peoples who had been excluded from the bronze trade. Networks, but who possessed ancient knowledge of working with iron. The weapons they create are crude compared to the finest bronze. Swords of the old world, but they possess advantages that go beyond mere sharpness or durability. Iron weapons can be made quickly, in large quantities, by smiths working with locally available materials. More importantly, they can be repaired and resharpened in the field, making them ideal for the nomadic warfare that the sea peoples have. Perfected through necessity. But iron alone does not explain the sea people's success. Drift now with your dreaming mind to observe their ships, those vessels that carried them across the Mediterranean like seeds on the wind. These are not the broad-beamed merchant ships of the Bronze Age trade networks, built for carrying maximum cargo on familiar routes. These are warships, sleek and fast, designed for the hit-and-run tactics of peoples who must strike quickly and escape before their enemies can organize a response. The ships themselves tell a story of adaptation and innovation. Many show influence from different maritime traditions, suggesting that the sea peoples learned from every coastline they visited, incorporating the best features of Egyptian river barges, Mycenaean galleys, and the fishing boats of a dozen different cultures. They are hybrid vessels, just like the peoples who sailed them, combining elements from across the Mediterranean world into something new and uniquely effective. Watch as one of these vessels approaches a Bronze Age port city in your dream vision. The attack, when it comes, follows a pattern that the sea peoples have perfected through bitter experience. There is no formal declaration of war, no exchange of diplomatic messages, no siege equipment slowly assembled over months of preparation. Instead, the ships appear at dawn, striking like lightning before the city's defenses can be properly organized. The warriors who leap from these vessels are unlike the professional soldiers of the great kingdoms. They fight with the desperate courage of people who have already lost everything, who know that defeat means not just military failure, but the extinction of their families and their way of life. Their tactics are fluid and opportunistic, adapting to local conditions rather than following rigid formations. Learned in royal military academies, but perhaps their greatest advantage lies not in their weapons or their ships, but in their knowledge of their enemies' weaknesses. Many of the sea peoples had once served the very kingdoms they now attacked. Former mercenaries knew the layout of palace complexes and the routines of garrison troops. Displaced craftsmen understood the economic vulnerabilities that could bring down even the mightiest city. Exiled nobles carried with them intimate knowledge of diplomatic alliances and political tensions that could be exploited. In your dreaming state, You can see this knowledge being shared around campfires, on beaches where the sea peoples gather between raids. An aging warrior who once served in the Hittite army describes the weak points in Anatolian fortifications. A former Egyptian scribe explains how the kingdom's northern defenses are organized. A Mycenaean refugee sketches the layout of palace workshops where valuable goods are stored. This is intelligence gathering on a scale that no Bronze Age kingdom had ever faced, conducted by an enemy that understood the system from within. The sea peoples also possessed something that their settled enemies had largely lost: the ability to move quickly and strike where they were not expected. The great kingdoms of the Bronze Age were built around fixed centers of power, cities and palaces that could not be moved when threatened. Their armies were designed to protect these centers, not to pursue a fleet of ships that could disappear beyond the horizon whenever the odds turned against them. This mobility gave the sea peoples what military theorists would later call strategic depth. When one operation failed, they could retreat to the sea and try again elsewhere. When one group was defeated, survivors could join other groups and continue the struggle. They were like water, flowing around obstacles, always seeking the path of least resistance. Impossible to grasp and hold. The psychological impact of their tactics was perhaps as important as their material advantages. Bronze Age warfare had evolved elaborate codes and protocols, systems of honor and negotiation that allowed for face-saving retreats and diplomatic solutions. The sea peoples recognized no such conventions. They struck without warning, showed no mercy to those who surrendered, and left no survivors to negotiate with. To kingdoms accustomed to predictable patterns of conflict, this must have seemed like fighting against natural disasters rather than human enemies. Yet even in their ruthlessness, the sea peoples showed a sophisticated understanding of their strategic situation. They did not simply destroy everything they encountered, but selectively targeted the institutions and infrastructure that maintained Bronze Age power. Trade networks were disrupted, but local craftsmen who could serve their needs were often spared. Royal palaces were burned, but ports and harbors were preserved for their own use. They were not mindless destroyers, but strategic revolutionaries, dismantling the old world with the precision of surgeon's dot in your dream. You can see the cumulative effect of these tactics spreading across the Mediterranean like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Each successful raid encourages imitators, both among the sea peoples themselves and among local populations who see opportunity in the chaos. Each disrupted trade route weakens the economic foundations of the remaining kingdoms. Each burned palace reduces the confidence of rulers who had seemed unshakable just years before. The sea peoples also benefited from what we might call the advantage of nothing left to lose. The great kingdoms fought to preserve what they had built over centuries, making them cautious and defensive. The sea peoples fought for survival itself, making them willing to take risks that more established powers would never contemplate. This desperation became a weapon in itself, driving them to victories that seemed impossible against superior numbers and resources. But perhaps most importantly, the sea peoples succeeded because they represented the future while their enemies represented the past. The Bronze Age world was ending whether they came or not, undermined by climate change, economic instability, and the internal contradictions of its own success. The sea peoples were not the cause of this collapse, but its manifestation, the human face of historical forces that no individual kingdom could resist. As your dream vision of these ancient warriors and their revolutionary tactics fades, you find yourself floating once again on the eternal Mediterranean, feeling the rhythm of waves that have carried the ships of conquerors and refugees, traders and pirates for thousands of years. The sea peoples sail on through your dreams, their iron weapons glinting in the starlight, their hybrid ships cutting through dark water toward destinations they cannot yet imagine, carrying with them the seeds of a new world built on the ruins of the old. Now, as you drift deeper into the realm of dreams and distant memory, let your consciousness expand beyond the immediate trauma of battles and burning cities. Rise higher until you can see not just the Mediterranean, but the entire world as it existed 3,200 years ago, a world caught in the grip of changes far more profound than any human conflict. Here, in this elevated perspective that only dreams can provide, you begin to glimpse the deeper currents that set the sea peoples in motion, forces as vast and inexorable as the turning of the seasons themselves. Feel the air around you growing, thinner and cooler as your dreaming mind ascends through layers of time and atmosphere. From this vantage point, you can perceive patterns invisible to those living through them, the slow dance of climate and civilization that plays out over decades and centuries. The Mediterranean world spread below you is like a vast organism, its cities pulsing with life, its trade routes flowing like arteries, its agricultural regions breathing with the rhythm of planting and harvest. But something is changing in this breathing. The rhythm is becoming irregular, strained, as if the great organism of Bronze Age civilization is struggling for air. The rains that have fallen with predictable regularity for generations are beginning to fail. Rivers that have flowed since the dawn of agriculture are running lower each year. Springs that have never gone dry are becoming muddy pools, then cracked. Earth, then memory. Let yourself drift down now through layers of cloud and time to witness the human face of these vast changes. Picture a farming village somewhere in the highlands of Anatolia, a place that has existed since the first farmers learned to plant grain in furrows. For 1,000 years, the same families have worked these fields, following patterns of cultivation passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, as unchanging as the mountains that ring their valley. But now, as you hover invisibly above their fields, you can see that something is terribly wrong. The grain that should be golden and heavy with seed stands stunted and brown. The wells that have supplied the village for generations show rings of exposed stone, where the water level has dropped year after year. The pastures where cattle once grazed are turning to dust that swirls in hot winds blowing from the south. It is not just a bad year, or even a sequence of bad years. This is something unprecedented in the memory of the oldest villagers, a change so profound that it calls into question everything they thought they knew about the world. The gods seem to have turned their faces away. The ancient compact between human effort and natural abundance appears to be broken. In your dream vision, you can see similar scenes playing out across the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. In the mountains of Greece, shepherds watch their flocks grow thin as pastures fail. In the plains of Syria, farmers abandon fields that their ancestors cleared from wilderness. In the highlands of the Levant, springs that once fed great cities become seasonal trickles, then dry beds lined with stones. Modern climate scientists, studying tree rings and lake sediments from this period, have identified what they call the Late Bronze Age collapse climate event, a period of prolonged drought and cooling that affected much of the northern hemisphere around 1200 BCE. But you, floating in the timeless space of dreams, can see beyond the scientific data to witness the human drama that unfolded as entire regions became uninhabitable within the span of a single generation. Watch now as the first trickle of refugees appears on the roads leading south and west from the failing agricultural regions. These are not yet the sea peoples of Egyptian inscriptions, not yet the raiders who will terrorize the Mediterranean coasts. These are farmers and herders, craftsmen and priests, ordinary people forced to abandon homes that their families have occupied since the world was young. At first, they move in small groups, hoping to find temporary refuge until the rains return and they can go home. Extended families travel together, their possessions loaded onto ox carts or carried on their backs. They follow traditional routes of kinship and trade, seeking shelter with distant relatives or communities that might remember old obligations. of hospitality. But as the drought persists and spreads, these individual streams of migration begin to merge into rivers of humanity flowing across the landscape. Villages that might have welcomed a few dozen refugees find themselves overwhelmed by hundreds, then thousands of displaced persons. Communities that have their own resources stretched thin by the changing climate have nothing to offer the growing. Crowds of desperate travelers dot in your dreaming consciousness. You can perceive the terrible mathematics of this crisis. Each failed harvest displaces more people, adding to the pressure on regions that are still marginally productive. Each community that collapses under the strain of supporting too many refugees sends its own population into the growing stream of migrants. The process feeds on itself, gathering momentum like an avalanche. Some groups turn east, toward the great river valleys of Mesopotamia, where ancient irrigation systems might still provide sustenance. Others head south, toward Egypt and the life-giving Nile, but many are drawn west, toward the sea that offers both escape from the dying land and access to regions that might still harbor hope of survival. It is here, at the intersection of desperation and opportunity, that ordinary refugees begin their transformation into the sea peoples of history. Watch as groups of displaced farmers and herders reach the Mediterranean coast, their ox carts and donkeys left behind, their possessions reduced to what can be carried aboard, whatever vessels they can find or steal or build from driftwood. And desperation. The sea that had once been a highway for peaceful trade now becomes a lifeline for peoples fleeing the collapse of their world. Fishing boats designed to work close to shore are pressed into service for long-distance voyages. Merchant vessels are seized by their former crews when their owners can no longer pay wages. New ships are built from the timbers of abandoned houses, their design influenced by memories of every type of vessel their builders have ever seen. But the sea offers no easy salvation. The Mediterranean in the throes of climate change is not the peaceful trading lake of Bronze Age prosperity. Storms are more frequent and violent. Currents shift as wind patterns change. Islands that once provided reliable sources of fresh water are themselves affected by the general aridification of the region. The groups that survive this maritime ordeal are transformed by it. They become harder, more desperate, more willing to take the risks that settled peoples would never contemplate. They learn to live as nomads of the sea, following rumors of undefended coasts and unguarded harbors. They develop the skills and the ruthlessness that will make them the terror of the Mediterranean world. In your dream vision, you can see how climate change acts as a great sorting mechanism, winnowing the displaced populations and selecting for those qualities that will make survival possible in a transformed world. The gentle farmers who once tended their fields with patient care are replaced by raiders who strike like storms and disappear like mist. The merchants who once conducted business through elaborate networks of trust and reciprocity become pirates, who take what they need and leave nothing but ash and terror in their wake. Yet even in this transformation, echoes of their former lives persist. A group of sea peoples raiding a coastal city might spare the temples while burning the palace, driven by religious sensibilities that survive their other losses. Warriors hardened by years of desperate struggle might still sing lullabies to their children in languages that no longer have a homeland. The great irony of the climate crisis that drove the sea peoples' migrations is that it eventually caught up with them wherever they went. The same drought that drove them from their original homes also affected the regions they invaded. Egypt, even in victory over the sea peoples, found itself weakened by crop failures and reduced Nile floods. The Levantan cities that fell to the invaders might have collapsed anyway, as their agricultural hinterlands dried up. Some modern researchers suggest that the Bronze Age collapse was not primarily caused by human conflict, but by environmental catastrophe. With the sea peoples, merely scavengers feeding on civilizations already dying from climate change. In this view, the Great Migrations were symptoms rather than causes of the collapse. Humanity's desperate attempt to adapt to a world that had become fundamentally different from the one their civilizations were designed to inhabit. As you're dreaming, consciousness contemplates these vast patterns of cause and effect. You begin to sense the tragic dimension of the Sea People's story. They were not villains choosing destruction over creation, but refugees from a dying world, struggling to survive in the only way left to them. Their raids and conquests were acts of desperation rather than aggression, the final spasms of communities that had already lost everything that made life meaningful. In the halls of ancient Egypt, scribes recorded not just battles and treaties, but also the fragments of stories that would outlive empires. The legend of Atlantis tells of how mysterious peoples waged war against the nations of the Mediterranean, eventually being subdued by the Greeks. But was this merely Plato's philosophical invention, or did it carry within it the genetic memory of something real? Imagine, if you will, the elderly priests of Memphis and Sais, their voices growing soft with age as they recounted to visiting Greeks the tales their grandfathers had told them. Tales of peoples who came from the sea, whose ships appeared on the horizon like a forest of masts, whose warriors fought with a desperation born of having no homeland to return to. The priests spoke of civilizations that had grown proud and mighty, then fell to invaders from across the waters. They described peoples who had once been moral and spiritual, but became greedy and morally bankrupt, until the gods themselves grew angry. Was this simply a cautionary tale about hubris, or was it the distant echo of actual catastrophe, filtered through generations until fact became fable? The gentle lapping of waves on papyrus boats carried these stories along the Nile, where they mixed with local myths and memories. Each telling added new details, smoothed away others, until the sharp edges of historical truth became as rounded as stones tumbled by endless tides. Far to the north, in the scattered islands of the Aegean, similar whispers arose from the wine-dark sea. The Greeks, who would later give us Homer's epics, had their own fragmentary memories of great upheavals. They spoke of the time when the old order crumbled, when mighty citadels fell dark, and when new people arrived to claim the empty lands. Some scholars believe that tales of Atlantis may have originated from distorted accounts of the Minoan civilization, a powerful naval empire centered on Crete during the Bronze Age, with colonies scattered across the Aegean islands. Perhaps the storytellers of later generations, finding ruined palaces and abandoned ports, wove these discoveries into tales of a lost civilization that had angered the gods. But there were other stories too, quieter ones that spoke not of divine punishment, but of human tragedy. Tales of peoples driven from their homes by famine or war, who took to their ships in desperate exodus. These stories carried a different tone, one of sympathy rather than judgment, as if the tellers remembered that they too were descendants of wanderers. In the flickering light of oil lamps, grandmothers would tell children about the time of great moving, when whole people packed their lives into ships and sailed toward uncertain horizons. They spoke of cities left empty, of trade routes abandoned, of a world that had once been connected, suddenly fragmenting into isolated communities struggling to survive. Even in the misty lands of the far north, where amber washed ashore and the nights grew long, stories emerged that seemed to echo these Mediterranean upheavals. The Proto-Norse peoples, who would centuries later give us the Viking sagas, preserved in their oral traditions tales of great southern journeys, of expeditions that had gone forth and never returned. These northern stories speak of heroes who sailed beyond the sunset, seeking new lands or fleeing some great catastrophe. They told of floating islands of refugees, of warrior bands that had lost their homes and taken to the sea as a way of life. The details were different, filtered through different cultures and landscapes, but the underlying pattern remained: peoples in motion, civilizations in flux, The sea is both destroyer and refuge. Perhaps some of the sea peoples had indeed come from these northern lands, carrying with them not just weapons and desperation, but also stories. Stories that would seed new myths in the Mediterranean, creating a complex web of cultural memory that spanned from the Baltic to the Nile. In the ancient texts that would become the Hebrew Bible, we find another thread in this tapestry of memory. The Philistines appear mostly as villainous enemies of the Israelites, the people who sent Delilah to cut Samson's hair, and whose giant Goliath was slain by David. Yet even in these adversarial accounts, there are hints of a more complex story. According to biblical tradition, the Philistines came from Caphtor, possibly Crete, and are often associated with the sea peoples due to their maritime history. The biblical authors preserve not just the conflicts, but also fragments of the Philistines' own story, their origins as displaced peoples seeking new homes. These accounts, written centuries after the events they describe, had transformed memory into meaning. The historical Philistines, who archaeological evidence suggests brought new technologies and cultural practices to Canaan, became in biblical narrative the embodiment of the foreign, the other, the perpetual enemy. Yet between the lines of condemnation, we can still glimpse the human reality. Refugees who became settlers, who built cities and raised families, who worshiped their own gods and preserved their own traditions in a new land. The biblical scribes, writing in exile themselves, perhaps understood better than they admitted the experience of displacement and the desperate search for belonging. Their harsh words for the Philistines may have carried within them the fear that they too might be forgotten, reduced to hostile footnotes in someone else's history. As the centuries passed, the specific details of the Bronze Age collapse and the sea people's role in it faded from active memory. But the emotional core of the experience lived on, transformed into myth and legend. The particular became universal. Every culture that had faced invasion, displacement, or collapse could see their own story reflected in these ancient tales. The sea peoples, who had left no written records of their own, became a blank canvas onto which later generations could project their fears and fantasies. They were cast as everything from noble refugees to barbaric destroyers, from divine instruments of justice to embodiments of chaos. In each retelling, they became less human and more archetypal, yet perhaps this transformation serves its own purpose. In becoming legendary, the sea peoples achieved a kind of immortality that historical accuracy alone could never provide. They became part of humanity's shared vocabulary for talking about upheaval, migration, and change. Every age has its sea peoples, its mysterious forces that arrive from distant shores to challenge the established order. The ancient poets understood something that we sometimes forget in our search for historical facts, that sometimes the deepest truths can only be approached through story. The bards who sang of mysterious people from the sea were not trying to create documentary records. They were trying to capture something more elusive and perhaps more important, the emotional and spiritual reality of living through times of great change. In their verses, the sea peoples became symbols of the unknowable forces that periodically reshape human civilization. They represent the fear that everything solid and familiar could suddenly prove fragile, that the networks of trade and diplomacy that connected communities could dissolve overnight, leaving isolated peoples to face an uncertain future alone. But they also represent resilience, the capacity of human beings to adapt and survive even the most catastrophic changes. In some stories, they were the agents of necessary destruction, clearing away decadent civilizations to make room for new growth. In others, they were examples of how displaced people could find new homes and create new societies. As we drift now on the quiet waters of sleep, consider how these ancient stories continue to resonate in our own time. We live in an age of global connections and rapid change, where economic networks span continents and cultural influences flow instantly across oceans. Like the Bronze Age world, our civilization depends on complex systems of trade and communication that we sometimes take for granted. The Sea Peoples remind us that such systems, however robust they may seem, are maintained by human effort and can be disrupted by human action. They whisper to us across the millennial that history is not a straight line of progress, but a series of cycles, of building and destruction, of connection and fragmentation. Yet they also remind us that endings are also beginnings, that from the ruins of the old, new forms of human organization and expression inevitably emerge. The dark age that followed the Bronze Age collapse was indeed dark for those who lived through it, but it was also the womb from which classical civilization would eventually be born, not in the end. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of the Sea Peoples. Story is what they did not leave behind. Their own words, their own version of events, their own names for themselves, and their motivations. This silence has become eloquent, allowing them to represent all the voiceless peoples of history, all those whose stories were told by others or not told at all. They remind us that history is always written by someone, from some perspective, with some agenda. The Egyptian scribes who recorded their battles with the Sea Peoples were not neutral observers, but participants in a conflict, with their own interests to protect and their own version of events to promote. The biblical authors who vilified the Philistines were creating national mythology as much as recording history. In the quiet spaces between these partisan accounts, in the archaeological evidence of burned cities and new technologies, in the genetic traces left in ancient DNA, we can glimpse fragments of a larger, more complex truth. But ultimately, the Sea People's greatest legacy may be that they teach us to listen for the stories that were never told, to imagine the perspectives that were never recorded, to honor the humanity of those who have become legends. As the waves of sleep wash over you now, let them carry with them this lesson from the ancient Mediterranean, that every age has its sea peoples, its mysterious forces of change, and that we must learn to navigate these changes with wisdom, compassion, and an understanding that today's certainties may be tomorrow's myths. The sea remembers everything and forgets nothing. In its endless motion, it preserves the stories of all who have traveled upon its surface, all who have trusted their lives to its mercy, all who have found in its vastness both terror and sanctuary. Sleep now and dream of distant sails on moonlit waters, carrying stories that will never be completely forgotten as long as the tides continue to turn. The Mediterranean stretches before us, now like a vast, dark mirror reflecting the stars. In its depths lie the remnants of bronze swords and ceramic shards, the scattered pieces of a world that once was. But as we drift on these gentle currents of time, let us remember that endings are rarely final. From the ashes of the old Bronze Age world, something new is quietly taking root. Close your eyes and imagine the coastline of ancient Canaan in the centuries following the great upheavals. Where once Egyptian garrisons had maintained order and Canaanite merchants had counted their profits in bronze ingots, new settlements were rising. The people who built them carried with them memories of distant shores and foreign customs. But they were learning to call this land home. Along the southern coast of what would one day be called Palestine, the Peliset, whom we know as the Philistines, were creating something entirely new. Archaeological evidence tells us a remarkable story of cultural adaptation and transformation. Many Philistines did indeed migrate from the Aegean world, bringing with them vestiges of Minoan culture. Yet within a few generations, they had become something uniquely their own. Picture, if you will, the city of Ashkelon around 1100 BCE. The morning sun illuminates pottery workshops where craftsmen shape clay vessels that blend Aegean traditions with local Canaanite techniques. The forms are familiar to anyone who knew the wine cups of Mycenae or the storage jars of Crete, yet the decorations speak of new influences, New stories, new identities being forged in the crucible of cultural contact. These were not conquerors, in the traditional sense, imposing their will upon a subjected population. The Philistines were settled in Egyptian strongholds in the southern Canaanite coastal plain, but they quickly evolved beyond their origins as displaced refugees or Egyptian mercenaries. They built cities that would endure for centuries, developed agricultural techniques suited to their new environment, and created art that spoke of both memory and hope, in the markets of Gaza and Ekron. Languages mingled as easily as spices in a merchant's pouch. Children grew up hearing the ancient songs of the Aegean, transformed by new melodies learned from Canaanite neighbors. Wedding ceremonies blended rituals brought from across the sea with customs rooted in the fertile soil of the Levant. This was not the preservation of a pure culture, but the birth of something hybrid and vital. The Philistines introduced new technologies to their adopted homeland. Their knowledge of iron working, possibly learned during their wanderings or developed from necessity, gave them advantages that extended far beyond warfare. Iron plows could break ground harder than bronze ones. Iron tools could fell forests and shape stone with greater efficiency. In teaching these skills to their neighbors, the Philistines became not just settlers, but innovators, contributing to the technological revolution that would define the Iron Age. Meanwhile, across the Aegean, the lands that had once known the glory of Mycenaean palaces entered what scholars call the Greek Dark Ages. The Mediterranean region entered a dark age in which iron replaced bronze as the metal of choice. Diplomacy and trade relations were nearly non-existent, and art, architecture, and general quality of life all suffered in comparison with the Bronze Age. Yet darkness, as any gardener knows, is where seeds germinate. Although ironworking thrived during this period, many of the Mycenaean cities and palaces remained abandoned. But in smaller settlements scattered across the Greek islands and mainland, communities were learning new ways to organize themselves, new forms of governance, new methods of survival. The collapse of the palatial system, devastating as it was for those who lived through it, also created opportunities. Without kings and scribes to control trade and tribute, individual communities had to become more self-reliant. They developed local crafts, local leadership structures, local traditions of storytelling and worship. The epic poems that would eventually become the Iliad and Odyssey were taking shape around fires in these humble settlements, preserving in oral tradition the memory of the heroic age that had passed. The writing systems of the Bronze Age palaces, Linear A and Linear B, disappeared with their scribal schools. Yet this apparent loss contained within it the seed of something revolutionary. When the Greeks eventually rediscovered writing by adapting the Phoenician alphabet, they created something the Bronze Age had never possessed, a writing system simple enough for ordinary people to learn. This democratization of literacy would eventually transform not just Greece, but the entire Mediterranean world. In the wake of the collapse, smaller communities developed different relationships with each other and with the land itself. The great trade networks that had carried tin from Britain and amber from the Baltic had shattered, forcing each region to rely more heavily on local resources. This limitation sparked innovation. Communities that had once imported copper began to mine their own. Regions that had depended on foreign craftsmen developed their own workshops. The absence of central authority also meant the absence of central taxation and corvée labor. Farmers who had once grown crops primarily to feed palace bureaucracies could now concentrate on feeding their own families and local communities. This shift toward local self-sufficiency may have reduced the overall volume of trade, but it also reduced the vulnerability that had made the Bronze Age system so fragile. New forms of social organization emerged from this decentralization. The Greek polis, or city-state, with its emphasis on citizen participation rather than royal decree, was one response to the collapse of centralized monarchy. In other regions, tribal confederations and merchant republics developed their own solutions to the problem of governance without kings. While much of the eastern Mediterranean struggled through its dark age, one group managed not just to survive, but to thrive in the new conditions. The Phoenicians, based in cities like Tyre and Sidon along the Lebanese coast, had been part of the Bronze Age trade network, but had avoided the worst of the destruction. In the power vacuum left by the collapse, they found unprecedented opportunities. These maritime merchants became the inheritors of many sea peoples' traditions, but they channeled their seafaring skills toward commerce rather than raiding. Phoenician. Ships carried not warriors, but traders, spreading not terror, but technology, ideas, and cultural innovations across the Mediterranean. They established trading posts and colonies from Spain to the Black Sea, creating a new kind of network based on mutual benefit rather than imperial dominance. The Phoenicians also preserved and transmitted many of the cultural achievements of the Bronze Age world. Their alphabet, derived from earlier Canaanite scripts, became the ancestor of most modern writing systems. Their maritime technology incorporated lessons learned from the sea-going people who had preceded them. In their temples and workshops, craftsmen maintained techniques that might otherwise have been lost forever. As the immediate chaos of the collapse subsidized, new regional powers began to assert themselves. The Neo-Assyrian Empire rose in Mesopotamia, eventually creating a military machine more efficient and ruthless than anything the Bronze Age had known. In Anatolia, Neo-Hittite kingdoms maintained some continuity with the earlier Hittite empire while adapting to new political realities. Egypt, though weakened, maintained its independence and even experienced periods of revival. The pharaohs of the 21st dynasty ruled from Tanis in the Nile Delta, a city built partly from stones taken from the abandoned monuments of earlier periods. This practice of recycling the past to build the present became a metaphor for the entire post-collapse world. In the Levant, new ethnic groups established themselves alongside older populations. The Israelite highland settlement occurred during this same period, as communities that identified themselves as distinct from both Canaanites and Philistines carved out their own territories in the hill country. These developments would eventually lead to the establishment of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, whose cultural and religious innovations would have consequences far beyond their small territories. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the Sea Peoples, and the collapse they helped precipitate, was the eventual birth of what we call classical antiquity. The Greek city-states that emerged from the Dark Ages developed forms of literature, philosophy, and political organization that would influence human civilization for millennia. The Roman Republic, which would eventually unite the Mediterranean under a single government for the first time since the Bronze Age, traced its own origins to the post-collapse period. The Hebrew Bible, with its revolutionary concept of ethical monotheism, was largely composed during and after the Iron Age transformation. Early Christianity emerged from the cultural ferment of a Mediterranean world that had been reshaped by the consequences of Bronze Age collapse. Islam, in its turn, drew upon both Greek philosophy and Hebrew scripture, creating syntheses that would not have been possible in the more rigid hierarchical world of the Bronze Age. As we float now on the peaceful waters of sleep, consider what the aftermath of the Sea People's impact teaches us about human resilience and adaptation. The Bronze Age collapse was undoubtedly a catastrophe for those who lived through it. Cities burned, populations scattered, and centuries of accumulated knowledge disappeared. Yet from this apparent ending came innovations and developments that enriched human civilization in ways the Bronze Age world could never have imagined. The Sea Peoples, in their role as both destroyers and seeds of renewal, remind us that history is not simply a matter of progress or decline, but of constant transformation. The palace cultures they helped to overthrow had their own achievements and glories, But they also had inherent limitations and vulnerabilities. The simpler societies that replaced them lacked the Bronze Age's monumental architecture and centralized power, but they possessed a flexibility and resilience that served them well in an uncertain world. The story of what came after the Sea Peoples is, in many ways, the story of how the Mediterranean world learned to live with uncertainty, to build societies that could adapt rather than simply endure. The city-states of ancient Greece, with their emphasis on debate and innovation, were one response to the collapse of absolute monarchy. The merchant republics of Phoenicia, with their networks of voluntary trade relationships, were another. Even the Philistines, often portrayed as mother antagonists in biblical narrative, contributed to this process of renewal. Their cities became centers of technological innovation and cultural exchange. Their integration into the broader Canaanite world demonstrated that identity need not be fixed or pure, that people could maintain their distinctiveness while adapting to new circumstances and new neighbors. As sleep carries you deeper into the realm of dreams, let the gentle rhythm of Mediterranean waves remind you that destruction and creation are often two faces of the same process. The Sea Peoples arrived, like a storm, scattering the established order and leaving chaos in their wake. But storms also bring rain to nourish new growth, and chaos creates space for innovation and change. The civilizations that emerged from the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse were not simply inferior copies of what had been lost. They were new experiments in human organization and culture, responses to challenges that required new solutions. Some of these experiments failed, disappearing as completely as the Sea Peoples themselves. Others succeeded beyond their creators' wildest dreams, shaping the world in which we still live today. In the end, the greatest legacy of the Sea Peoples may be their demonstration that even the most established and seemingly permanent civilizations are, in fact, temporary arrangements subject to forces beyond their control. Yet their story also shows us that human communities possess remarkable powers of recovery and reinvention. From the fragments of the old, they can construct something entirely new, something that honors the past while embracing the future. Sleep now and dream of coastal settlements where children play games that blend the traditions of many lands, where merchants speak languages that carry words from across the sea, where potters shape clay with techniques learned from both ancestors and strangers. Dream of a world being reborn, not through grand design, but through the countless small acts of adaptation and hope that define the human experience. The waves that once carried the Sea Peoples to distant shores now carry only the whispered promise that every ending is also a beginning, every destruction the prelude to creation. In recent years, the search for the Sea Peoples has been transformed by a revolutionary tool that previous generations of archaeologists could never have imagined. Ancient DNA analysis has opened windows into the past that allow us to trace population, movements, and cultural exchanges with unprecedented precision. The bones of people who died 3,000 years ago can now tell us where their ancestors came from, whom they married, and how their communities changed over time. At the ancient city of Ashkelon, scientists analyzed DNA from 10 individuals, spanning from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age. The results were striking. DNA from early Iron Age burials showed a European genetic component that distinguished them from the local Bronze Age Canaanite population, supporting the idea that the Philistines originated in the Aegean region, possibly Crete. Picture, if you will, the moment when researchers first saw these genetic signatures appear on their computer screens. Years of careful excavation, months of laboratory analysis, and centuries of scholarly debate suddenly crystallized into clear evidence. The Philistines, it seemed, really had brought with them genes from distant shores, carrying in their very DNA the story of their maritime journey. Yet even as this evidence solved one mystery, it opened others. The genetic evidence also suggests that any newcomers quickly acculturated, blending with local populations within a few generations. This rapid integration raised new questions about identity, culture, and what it means to belong to a place. Were the Sea Peoples conquerors who imposed their will, or were they refugees who adapted to survive? One of the most significant breakthroughs. In Sea Peoples, research came with the discovery of an intact Philistine cemetery at Ashkelon. For decades, archaeologists had studied Philistine cities, houses, and artifacts, but they had never found a cemetery, never had the opportunity to study how these people treated their dead, what they believed about the afterlife, how they honored their ancestors. The unprecedented find of a cemetery in Israel may finally change the narrative that has primarily been told by the Philistines' enemies. In the gentle Mediterranean climate, organic materials that would have decayed elsewhere had been preserved. Archaeologists found not just bones, but also jewelry, pottery, and even traces of the oils and perfumes that had been used in burial rituals. The cemetery revealed a culture that was neither purely foreign nor completely assimilated. Pottery found at Philistine archaeological sites appeared to have been made locally, but looked distinctly different from local Canaanite traditions, showing clear Aegean influences in both form and decoration. The burial practices themselves represent a fascinating blend of traditions, some clearly from the migrants' homeland, others adapted from their new neighbors. Imagine walking through this ancient cemetery in the soft light of an archaeological lamp, seeing the careful arrangement of grave goods, the evidence of ritual meals held to honor the dead, the small personal items that speak of individual lives lived thousands of years ago. Each burial tells a story not just of death but of memory, of communities maintaining connections to their past while adapting to their present. One of the most unexpected contributions to Sea Peoples research has come from an unlikely source: pig genetics. DNA analysis of ancient and modern pigs from Israel revealed that while pigs from the late Bronze Age shared genetic signatures with other Near Eastern pigs, European pig genes became dominant during the Iron Age around 900 BCE, possibly brought by the Sea Peoples who migrated to the Levant. This discovery illustrates how modern archaeology approaches the past from multiple angles, finding evidence in places that earlier scholars would never have thought to look. The pigs that the Sea Peoples brought with them carried their own genetic stories, their own evidence of long journeys and cultural exchanges. Even domestic animals became witnesses to one of history's great migrations. The pig evidence also reveals something profound about cultural change and adaptation. The Sea Peoples didn't just bring new pottery styles or new weapons. They brought entire ecosystems of plants and animals, transforming the biological as well as the cultural landscape of their new homes. This biological evidence suggests that their impact was deeper and more lasting than even the archaeological record had indicated. The island of Oahu, Cyprus, has become a crucial laboratory for understanding ancient Mediterranean seafaring and migration patterns. Archaeological evidence shows sporadic seafaring visits to Cyprus by Epipaleolithic hunter-gatherers over 12,000 years ago, followed by permanent settlements during the early Neolithic. This long history of maritime contact makes Cyprus an ideal place to study how ancient peoples moved across the Mediterranean and how they established new communities on distant shores. Although direct material evidence, such as shipwrecks or ship representations, is lacking before about 2000 BC. The maritime capabilities developed by early seafarers enabled them to explore new lands, tap new marine resources, and make use of accessible coastal sites. The story of Cyprus reminds us that the Sea Peoples were part of a much longer tradition of Mediterranean seafaring, that their voyages built upon thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about winds, currents, and navigation. Modern research on Cyprus uses computer modeling to understand ancient seafaring routes, testing hypotheses about how ancient mariners might have navigated between islands and mainlands. These studies help us appreciate the skill and courage required for ancient sea voyages, the careful planning and deep knowledge of natural patterns that made such journeys possible. Despite decades of research and revolutionary new tools, fundamental questions about the Sea Peoples remain unresolved. The Sea Peoples were an amalgamation of various ethnic groups, primarily of Aegean and southeastern origin, but the exact relationship between these different groups remains unclear. Were they allies who coordinated their movements, or were they independent groups responding to similar pressures? The scholarly community continues to debate whether the Sea Peoples should be understood primarily as invaders, refugees, or something more complex. Some researchers argue that they were climate refugees, driven from their homes by drought and environmental degradation. Others see them as displaced populations caught up in the broader system's collapse of the Late Bronze Age. Still others suggest that they were opportunistic groups who took advantage of political instability to establish new territories. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to inform our understanding of Philistine culture, economy, and origins, but each new discovery seems to reveal the complexity of ancient identities rather than providing simple answers. The more we learn about the Sea Peoples, the more we realize how inadequate our modern categories of ethnicity and nationality are for understanding ancient population movements. The search for the Sea Peoples has been transformed not just by ancient DNA analysis, but by a wide range of new technologies. Ground-penetrating radar allows archaeologists to map buried structures without excavation. Satellite imagery reveals settlement patterns invisible from ground level. Chemical analysis of pottery and metal objects can trace trade networks and technological exchanges. Underwater archaeology has opened entirely new avenues of research. Shipwrecks from the Late Bronze Age, like the famous Uluburan wreck off the coast of Turkey, provide snapshots of the complex trade networks that connected the ancient Mediterranean. These underwater sites preserve organic materials and everyday objects that rarely survive on land, offering intimate glimpses into the daily lives of ancient seafarers. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones can reveal where individuals spent their childhoods, tracing population movements with remarkable precision. This technique has been particularly valuable for understanding the Sea Peoples because it can distinguish between people who migrated as adults and those who were born in their new homes, helping researchers understand the dynamics of ancient communities. Modern technology has also democratized access to archaeological knowledge in ways that would have amazed earlier generations of scholars. High-resolution images of excavations are shared instantly around the world. Databases of artifacts and genetic sequences allow researchers from different continents to collaborate on projects. Amateur archaeologists and citizen scientists contribute observations and discoveries that professional archaeologists might otherwise miss. Social media and online platforms have created new communities of people interested in ancient history, sharing discoveries and debating interpretations in real time. This democratization has both benefits and challenges, as reliable information blends with speculation and sensationalism. Yet it also means that the search for the Sea Peoples has become a truly global endeavor, engaging minds and imaginations far beyond the traditional academic world. As sophisticated as modern archaeological methods have become, they still face fundamental limitations. Primary sources about the Sea Peoples remain limited and often biased, written by their enemies and preserved by accident rather than design. Ancient DNA can tell us about population movements, but not about the thoughts, motivations, or experiences of ancient peoples. The Sea Peoples left no literature, no royal inscriptions, no chronicles of their own journeys and struggles. We can analyze their pottery, study their burial practices, and trace their genetic signatures. but we cannot hear their voices or understand their own perspective on the events that made them historical figures. This silence is itself a form of evidence, reminding us that history is often written by the winners, and that many important stories are never preserved. Archaeological evidence is also fragmentary by nature. We find the objects that survived. Study the sites that haven't been destroyed by later construction. Analyze the remains that happen to be preserved by favorable environmental conditions. The picture we construct from this evidence is necessarily incomplete, like trying to understand a complex painting from a handful of scattered brushstrokes. Perhaps the most important aspect of the modern research for the Sea Peoples is how it has humanized these ancient figures. Earlier scholarship often portrayed them as faceless hordes, barbarian destroyers of civilization. Modern research reveals them as real people facing real challenges. Families seeking safety, communities trying to preserve their traditions in new environments, individuals adapting to circumstances beyond their control. The children buried in the Ascalon cemetery were loved by their parents, mourned by their communities, honored with grave goods that reflected both ancient traditions and new adaptations. The potters who created hybrid vessels were practical, solving problems while expressing cultural identities. The farmers who brought European pigs to the Levant were trying to recreate familiar foods in an unfamiliar landscape. This humanization of the Sea Peoples has broader implications for how we understand migration and cultural change in both ancient and modern contexts. It reminds us that behind every population movement are individual stories of hope and loss, adaptation and resistance, success and failure. As we drift now toward sleep on the gentle currents of the Mediterranean, consider how the search for the Sea Peoples continues to evolve. New excavations are planned, new technologies are being developed, new questions are being formulated. The mystery that captivated 19th century Egyptiologists continues to engage 21st century scientists, each generation bringing new tools and perspectives to bear on these ancient puzzles. Young archaeologists today are learning techniques that didn't exist when their professors were students. They're asking questions that previous generations couldn't have imagined, using evidence that was invisible to earlier scholars. Yet they're also building on centuries of careful scholarship, standing on the shoulders of all those who came before them in the patient work of understanding the past. The Sea Peoples may have thought their story ended when their ships reached shore and their communities settled into new routines. They could not have imagined that 3,000 years later, people would still be trying to understand who they were and what their journeys meant. In a sense, their voyage continues in the minds and laboratories of modern researchers. Their story still unfolding as new evidence emerges from ancient sites. What drives this continued fascination with the Sea Peoples? Perhaps it is because their story touches on themes that remain relevant to our own time: migration and displacement, cultural adaptation and preservation, the challenges of building new communities in unfamiliar places. In our own age of global movement and cultural mixing, the Sea Peoples' experiences resonate across the millennial dot, or perhaps it is simply the human attraction to mystery, the desire to solve puzzles and understand the unknown. The Sea Peoples represent one of archaeology's great detective stories, a case that remains open despite decades of investigation. Each new piece of evidence changes our understanding slightly, keeps the investigation alive, maintains the hope that someday we might finally understand who they really were. As you drift deeper into sleep, let the rhythm of research and discovery carry you forward. Imagine future archaeologists making new findings, future technologies revealing new secrets, future generations asking new questions about these ancient wanderers. The Sea Peoples may be long gone, but the search for them continues, an eternal voyage of discovery that mirrors their own journeys across the wide dark sea. In the end, perhaps the most important thing we've learned from modern research is that the sea peoples were not so different from ourselves. People trying to make sense of a changing world. Communities working to preserve what mattered to them while adapting to new circumstances. Individuals whose stories deserve to be told with complexity and compassion rather than simple judgment. Sleep now and dream of patient archaeologists working under Mediterranean sun, of laboratory technicians examining ancient DNA, of scholars around the world collaborating to piece together fragments of a story that began 3,000 years ago and continues still. The search goes on, as endless and as necessary as the tides themselves. As we drift deeper into the gentle embrace of this ancient mystery, let us pause at the threshold between what was and what is. Here, in this quiet space between sleeping and waking, we find ourselves standing on a shore that exists in all times at once. The waves that lap at our feet carry within them the echoes of 3,000 years, whispering secrets that only the sea remembers. Close your eyes now and feel the warm sand beneath you. This is not just any beach, but the very coastline where history turned its great wheel. The Mediterranean stretches before us, its surface catching the last light of evening, and in that shimmering expanse, we can almost see the ghostly outlines of ships that once changed the world. The question that has guided us through this long night's journey begins to take on new meaning here at the edge of sleep. Were the sea peoples truly the destroyers of civilizations, or were they something else entirely? Something that speaks to the deepest currents of human experience, flowing beneath the surface of every age, including our own? As you breathe in the salt air, consider this. Perhaps what we've been calling destruction was actually transformation. The great Bronze Age world, with its gleaming palaces and intricate trade networks, its royal correspondence and diplomatic marriages, had grown. So complex, so interdependent, that it had become as fragile as a web of finest silk. One tremor, one break in the pattern, and the entire structure would shimmer and collapse. Does this sound familiar? In our own time, we have built a world of staggering complexity. Supply chains that circle the globe like invisible threads, economies that pulse with the rhythm of distant markets, communication networks that bind us all in an instant web of connection. We, too, have created something magnificent and fragile, something that depends on countless moving parts working in perfect harmony. The sea peoples, those mysterious wanderers who emerged from the mists of the 13th century before Christ, may have been less like destroyers and more like harbingers of change that was already coming. They were the visible symptom of invisible pressures, climate shifts that dried up rivers and withered crops, population movements that began as whispers and grew into roars, the slow breakdown of trust between kingdoms that had once called each other brother. Listen to the waves for a moment. Can you hear it? That subtle change in their rhythm, the way they seem to carry voices from across the centuries? These are the same waters that bore the ships of the Sheridan and the Peliset, the Checker and the Denyen. The same salt spray that touched the faces of desperate families seeking new homes, of warriors who had lost their old purposes, of entire peoples who had been set adrift by forces beyond their control. They were not so different from us, these ancient wanderers. They faced the collapse of the only world they had ever known, watched as certainties crumbled and familiar landmarks disappeared beneath the tide of change. They had to make choices, stay and perish with the old ways, or take to the sea and risk everything on the hope of finding something new. And perhaps that is the most profound lesson they offer us. These forgotten voices from the depths of time. They remind us that collapse and renewal are part of the same great rhythm, as natural as the breathing of the sea itself. The Bronze Age civilizations that fell to their advance had themselves risen from the ashes of earlier worlds. The Mycenaeans, who built their proud citadels, had displaced others. The Hittites, who carved their empire from the Anatolian highlands, had swept away kingdoms whose names we no longer remember. This is the eternal dance of human civilization, creation and destruction, order and chaos, the familiar and the unknown locked in an endless embrace. The sea peoples were not outside this dance. They were part of it, playing their role in the great transformation that would give birth to the classical world we know and love. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine yourself floating on these ancient waters. You are carried by currents that connect all times, all peoples, all stories. Beneath you, the sea floor holds the remains of Bronze Age ships, their bronze weapons now green with verdigris, their wooden hulls long since returned to the embrace of the deep. But their passage is still felt in the water's motion, still remembered in the sea's eternal song. The world they destroyed was indeed magnificent. The palace at Knossos, with its labyrinthine passages and leaping dolphins painted on the walls. The great fortress of Hattusa, where the Hittite kings corresponded with pharaohs as equals. The citadel of Mycenae, behind whose lion gates Agamemnon may have walked, preparing for his fateful journey to Troy. The cosmopolitan port of Ugarit, where merchants from a dozen lands haggled in as many languages over copper and tin, ivory and precious stones. All of this was swept away, yes. But in its place arose something new, the Iron Age world of city-states and alphabets, of Homer's epics and the philosophical schools of ancient Greece. The Phoenicians, perhaps descendants of the very Canaanite cities the sea peoples had ravaged, would spread their alphabet across the Mediterranean, giving the gift of literacy to peoples who had never known writing. The Greeks, emerging from their dark age, would create democracy and geometry, tragedy and comedy, ways of thinking about the world that still shape our minds today. The sea peoples had played their part in this great transformation, though they themselves vanished into the mists of history as mysteriously as they had emerged. Some settled and became the Philistines of biblical memory. Others may have sailed west, carrying their skills and stories to shores we can only imagine. Still others simply melted back into the populations they had once disrupted, their genes and their memories becoming part of the great human river that flows through time. But they left us something precious, the knowledge that change, however terrifying, is also the source of renewal. That when old worlds crack and crumble, new ones are born in the spaces between. That the very forces that seem most destructive may also be the most creative, clearing away what has grown rigid and stale to make room for fresh possibilities. In our own age of rapid change, when familiar certainties seem to shift beneath our feet like sand, when the news brings daily reminders of our world's fragility and interconnectedness, the sea peoples speak to us across the centuries. They remind us that we are not the first to face such challenges, nor will we be the last. They whisper that human resilience is deeper than any particular civilization, that the capacity for renewal lies coiled within every ending. The waves are growing gentler now, their rhythm slower and more hypnotic. Feel yourself being rocked by the same motion that has soothed countless generations before you. The sea peoples have returned to the deep from which they came, but their story continues in every person who has ever had to leave home to find home, who has ever had to destroy in order to create, who has ever stood at the edge of the unknown and chosen to step forward into uncertainty rather than backward into a past that no longer exists. As sleep begins to claim you, as your breathing synchronizes with the eternal pulse of the sea, know that you are part of this great story. The same courage that carried the sea peoples across unknown waters flows in your veins. The same adaptability that allowed civilizations to rise from the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse lives in your heart. The same capacity for renewal that has carried humanity through every dark age burns bright within you. The sea peoples are no longer mysterious destroyers from the depths of history. They are our ancestors in adaptation, our teachers in the art of transformation. They remind us that every ending is also a beginning, every collapse also a birth, every darkness also the prelude to a new dawn. And so, as the last light fades, from the ancient sea, as the waves whisper their eternal lullaby, let yourself sink into the peaceful depths of sleep. Dream of ships with sails like clouds, of peoples who carried the future in their hearts, even as they fled the burning cities. Of the past, dream of the sound of forgotten waves that still echo in the depths of time, carrying their cargo of memory and hope to shores not yet imagined. The sea peoples have completed their long journey at last, not to destruction, but to understanding. Not to an ending, but to a transformation as gentle and natural as the tide. And in that transformation, we find our own hope, our own promise that whatever storms may come, the human spirit will endure, will adapt, will find new shores on which to build new dreams. Sleep now, carried by the same waters that bore them home. And so we reach the end of our long journey through the mists of ancient time, though endings, as we have learned, are simply doorways to new beginnings. The night has grown deep around us, and the Mediterranean lies calm beneath a canopy of stars that watched over the sea peoples 30 centuries ago and watch over us still. Feel yourself floating now on these timeless waters, supported by currents that have carried the dreams and sorrows of countless generations. The sea beneath you is neither warm nor cold, but perfectly matched to your body's rhythm, cradling you as gently as a mother rocks her sleeping child. This is the same sea that received the last breath of Bronze Age civilizations, the same waters that welcomed the ships of those mysterious wanderers we have come to know so well. The waves have found their most gentle rhythm now, barely more than a whisper against the shore of sleep. Each soft surge carries with it the accumulated wisdom of our journey, the rise and fall of great cities, the courage of peoples who sailed into the unknown, the eternal dance between destruction and creation that shapes all human story. Let these insights settle into your mind like sediment on the ocean floor, becoming part of the deep foundation upon which your dreams will build in the growing quiet. You might find that your breathing has synchronized with something ancient and profound. It is the respiration of history itself, the slow inhale of civilizations rising, the gentle exhale of empires returning to dust. But there is no sadness in this rhythm, only the natural peace that comes from understanding your place in the great pattern, your connection to all who have come before and all who will come after. The darkness around you is not empty, but full of invisible presence. The sea peoples themselves seem to drift past in the night, their ancient vessels now made of moonlight and memory. They nod to you as they pass, these once feared destroyers, who we now understand as fellow travelers on the endless human journey. Their ships are silent, their purpose fulfilled, their story at last complete in the telling. But listen carefully as they fade into the distance. Can you hear it? That subtle sound beneath the whisper of waves, beneath the soft chorus of night. Breathing? It is the gentle percussion of oars, cutting through dark water, rhythmic and hypnotic, growing fainter and fainter until it becomes part of the sea's eternal symphony. This is the sound that has haunted the Mediterranean for 3,000 years. The echo of a passage that changed the world and then vanished into legend. The water around you seems to glow now with its own inner light, as if the accumulated stories we have shared have given it luminescence. Each ripple carries images from our long night's journey, the burning towers of Ugarit reflected in the harbor waters, the proud ships of Ramses III pursuing shadows across the Nile Delta, the quiet archaeologists in dusty trenches piecing together fragments of a puzzle that may never be completely solved. But completeness was never the goal, was it? The true gift of the sea peoples lies not in the answers they provide, but in the questions they inspire, not in the certainties they offer, but in the mysteries they preserve. They remind us that some of the most important truths cannot be written in books or carved in stone, but must be felt in the blood, dreamed in the depths of sleep, whispered from one generation to the next, like secrets passed between waves. As the last of their ghostly fleet disappears beyond the horizon of consciousness, you find yourself alone on the darkened sea, but it is not a lonely solitude. You are connected to every soul who has ever pondered the great mysteries of the past, every dreamer who has found peace in the contemplation of ancient stories, every seeker who has discovered that sometimes the journey is more valuable than the destination. The stars above begin to blur and soften, not because they are fading, but because your eyes are growing heavy with the sweet weight of approaching sleep. These same constellations guided the sea peoples across unknown waters, helped Egyptian astronomers calculate the flooding of the Nile, watched over the construction of the great palaces whose ruins we explored tonight. They are the eternal witnesses, the unchanging observers of all our human drama, and they approve of your peaceful surrender to rest. Feel the sea beneath you beginning to change, becoming softer than water, more embracing than any earthly ocean. This is the sea of dreams, where all stories converge, where past and present flow together in currents of pure understanding. The sea peoples are waiting for you there, no longer mysterious or threatening, but welcoming you as a fellow voyager, who has learned their most important lesson, that every ending carries within it the seed of renewal, every destruction the promise of new creation. The sound of waves grows ever softer, blending now with the quiet rhythm of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, your own gentle descent into the peaceful depths. The Mediterranean has become a lullaby, the Bronze Age collapse a bedtime story. The sea peoples themselves, the guardians of your sleep. They have shared their secrets with you, and now they withdraw with the satisfied silence of teachers whose work is done. In the growing quiet, one last image forms in the darkness behind your closed eyes. A single ship, its sail luminous in starlight, moving slowly across the surface of a sea so still it might be made of glass. The vessel carries no cargo now except the accumulated dreams of everyone who has ever wondered about its passengers, everyone who has ever found comfort in contemplating the great cycles of history, everyone who has ever discovered peace in the knowledge that we are all part of something larger than ourselves. The ship grows smaller as it sails toward the horizon of sleep, but its light never dims. It becomes a star, then a memory of a star, then something even more precious, a feeling of profound connection to the vast sweep of human experience, a sense of floating safely in the great river of time that carries us all toward shores we cannot yet imagine, but need not fear. And now there is only silence, broken occasionally by the gentlest whisper of waves that might be real or might be dreams, might be the Mediterranean of ancient times or the peaceful ocean of sleep itself. The sea peoples have completed their longest voyage at last, carrying you with them into the realm where all mysteries find their resolution not in answers, but in the deep, wordless understanding that comes only in dreams. Sleep now, dear traveler. Sleep beneath the shifting tides of time, cradled by the same waters that bore the ancient world to its transformation. Let the sea peoples watch over your rest, as they have watched over these stories for 3,000 years, keeping them safe in the depths, until another dreamer comes to claim them, if you listen very carefully in the moments before full sleep. Claims you might hear it one last time, the distant sound of oars in dark water, growing fainter and fainter until it becomes indistinguishable from the beating of your own peaceful heart. The sea peoples have returned to the mystery from which they came, but they have left you something precious in exchange, the knowledge that you, too, are part of the great story, part of the endless human journey across the waters of time. In that knowledge, you can rest at last, floating safely in the embrace of history itself, dreaming the dreams that connect all times and all peoples, carried gently forward by currents that never end, toward shores that exist only in the peaceful country of sleep.